はい、皆さん、こんばんは。建築情報学会チャンネル、今回、も、建築家、デザイナー、クリエイターの方と、対談させてもらいます。で今回の、ゲストは、アメリカより、ホセ・サンチェス氏に、参加いただいて、今回は英語で、このイントロダクションの後は英語でお送りします。で、ホセ・サンチェス氏は、現在、デトロイトに在住で、ミシガン大学で准教授をされていて、建築家であり、ゲームデザイナーであり、建築理論家であるという方です。で、特に本日は、ゲームと建築みたいな視点から話を、していこうかなと思うんですけども、特に彼は、すでにゲームを一つ大きなものを、発売してまして、大手 PC ゲームプラットフォームの Steam というところに2016年に最も期待されたゲームで、ブロックフットという、ゲームが、発表されており、今現在、今年発売される予定の次回作、コモンフットというのに取り組まれている最中です。で、最近、書籍も出版されていて、建築理論というそのゲームの裏にある理論なんかも執筆されています。もともとはロンドンの、AA、アーキテクチャアソシエーションの方で教育を受けられて、で、その後いろいろAA や、バートレUCL バートレット、もしくはあとロサンゼルスの USC で教鞭を取られて、現在はミシガンの方で教えられています。それでは、ここからは、英語で話をさせてもらいます。Hey, Jose. Thank you for coming.
Hi. Thanks for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
Great. So, you have a really very unique kind of skill set or like activity as an architect, and you develop games. And so, kind of, I'm interested to talk about it, and especially, so when I met you in Los Angeles, you weren't necessarily like a developing game, but you were already interested in games. So, how did you become a game developer through your architectural background, education, and career?
Right. So, I had a very traditional architectural education in Chile, where I'm originally from, where I learned how to kind of 3D model and, render and things like that. But I didn't know programming necessarily. I actually went to London to study at the Architectural Association, where I learned things like processing, and I actually started teaching processing and programming in Java. And it really became a passion, something that I wanted to do every day in many ways. But it wasn't until actually I started my own studio in the Bartlett in 2013, where I decided to migrate all the work that I've been doing in generative design and in coding to a game engine, right? Something like Unity, right? Unity has been the game engine that I've been using since then. And I was really trying to connect the ideas of generative design, right? Like what you would do writing a script and creating geometry, let's say a fractal geometry or a different kind of approach towards generative design. I was trying to create something more interactive, right? I wanted to have the intuition of the architect, the knowledge that we have for architecture as something that we could touch the screen or move the mouse and interact with the computation, right? And for me, that felt and looked a lot more like a game, right? A game has always been a software that has some rules and some constraints, but it gives a lot of freedom to the player. So the player can move around and interact with different things, right? So I tried to start changing the approach where generative design, all the code was written before and you would execute the architecture as having a code that would allow it to be played with, right? And that was the beginning. It was a studio called Gamescapes in the Bartlett, and I've been working on games and architecture ever since.
Mm-hmm. Good. It's quite interesting. Like you start by choosing different platforms, and somehow platform changes you in a way. But at the same time, you always had an interesting game, and maybe specific type of game. But so that kind of all kind of came together, and then you ended up developing game, I guess. So can you tell us about that, like a first game, the Blockfoot?
Yeah, absolutely. I grew up playing games, and for many reasons, I guess, as you grow up, maybe I left behind my passion for games, but I was a big fan of things like SimCity and projects. You know, a lot of smaller projects as well. But SimCity certainly was a big influence. So when I started doing games in the Bartlett, we did a few projects that were more like prototypes. I wouldn't call them full games. We were using a game engine, but I thought that one of the powers of really doing a game, an architecture agenda, was really putting a piece of software, a game, into the public in a very professional way, right? So we actually, I remember when we collaborated for the Smart Geometry Conference in Hong Kong in 2014 to do the prototype of something that we called Block at the time. There was an idea there would be a game. I remember you were working on the agent-based system, the simulation of people moving around the game, and I was working on the tiles and the blocks, right? And Sergio Irigoyen, who was also collaborating, we created this very little prototype. But it took several years, I would say two and a half years after that initial prototype to convert that into something that the public could experience as a professional game, right? If you don't mind, I could maybe share my screen a little bit to show. I have a little video of Blockhood. So Blockhood really became a full-time project for me. It was a small team. Initially, it was myself working on this project, but then became a small team of 2 to 3 people. And we really wanted to put it in the hands of a public, right? So I learned that taking a game all the way to professional development was certainly more challenging than what I originally expected. But it went really well. I was really happy with the response of our audience. The fact that we got the kind of reception in many places like Japan or France and many other countries have been receiving the game really well. The game mainly, it's about how the different tiles that define our cities interact with each other to define a kind of an ecological system, right? This is kind of images of how the game is played, a little bit in fast motion, but the people that are in the game really exist because there's an affordance for a particular kind of inhabitation, right? So if you produce trees, you will get deer, but if you produce apartments, you would get people, and like that, the game can allow you to create all sorts of different configurations.
Right. So that was so you released this game like 2016, I think.
Right. The game was originally launched in 2016 as an early access format. That's a format that allows us to continue doing improvements to the game. And the final release was in 2017, when we considered the game was finished. Of course, there's been patches and changes to the game ever since, but like our final release was 2017.
Right. Then you mentioned like a SimCity game, and then but like some people might think like there's a certain kind of like a parallel aesthetics or atmosphere with Minecraft. Though you went into game before Minecraft came, right? So somehow that was in a way you were kind of synchronized with a kind of ethos of time, that kind of thing. So how do you see that? How this kind of whole modular aesthetics or like approach kind of came to you and came to the world?
I think that Minecraft was there or was like in an early stage already. I was aware of Minecraft. I think that the kind of more profound reflection upon the maybe the aesthetics are seen as cube-like, but in a way, for someone that it's starting to doing a first game, using kind of a data structure like a grid, right, was perhaps a simple approach to get started, right? So I was, for instance, what I was doing in generative design was a lot to do with like cellular automatas or calculations that were grid-based, right? So neighbors, how do you one neighbor could kind of communicate and send messages to another neighbor? And in many ways, Blockhood, it's a very large cellular automata with many layers of information passing between tiles to each other. The fact that they are presented not in black and white, but rather with kind of graphics that are associated to a city, that kind of gives us a bit of a hint to a different kind of meaning on the simulation. But the foundational computation, it's a computation that has to do with a grid-based computation. And I think that things like Minecraft similarly take advantage of using a voxel, or like, in a way, they did a really kind of clever algorithm, originally designed by Zach Barth, the person behind Infiniminer and a bunch of other games. But this really fantastic use of an interactive use of a voxel as a way of kind of replacing material. So that was certainly an influence. I was also influenced by things like Dwarf Fortress, which is another kind of slightly more niche and obscure game, but I think also using kind of a 2D representation of a three-dimensional voxel with a very highly complex interaction between tiles. I remember writing a paper at the time called Hack Lights and really speculating about how the interaction of entities within these kind of grid worlds could still yield unexpected results, right?
Right.
So I was really fascinated by the affordances of a data structure, what the data structure could do, and then adding a second data structure, which was the agents, right? Like the simulated agents that would actually move freely. So you have two things: you have a grid, and then you have a free movement of agents, which is something that I was doing already in my processing library. My agent-based library was a grid, a grid computation of a terrain and an agent-based system as a free-floating system. Right. So there is kind of a continuation of a form of understanding computation and systems that could actually simulate different forms of ecologies in many ways.
All right. So actually, I remember you mentioned about the Dwarf Fortress, and actually, I didn't know about that, so I looked into it, and that was quite crazy, complex game, right? I mean, it's all kind of ASCII type of graphics, but behind ASCII graphics, the whole system is insanely complex. I assume like each rule is simple, but like it's very, I guess it's even now, like even developers, they don't really know what they can do with that game. Like they don't see all the possibility yet, and the users didn't.
That's correct.
So it's an open-ended game, not as a kind of framework, but like a bottom-up kind of development of game led the whole world to be open-ended and very infinite possibility, and then that possibility is still people are kind of digging into. So that's insanely, amazing. And but then you are also into like an open-end game, right? So you don't necessarily want to have like a total RPG type of game, but you kind of really stimulate users' creativity, and that's specific type of game. So, but that's really because it's tied to like your desire for you to create and for others to create.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, I find myself very comfortable, and like my research tries to create tools that others could use, and to create architecture, to create beautiful things in a way. And I always try to optimize or improve the way in which creativity could be sparked within the environments, within the simulations that I create. How do I reduce the friction for creativity? How can people share knowledge with each other? How and fundamentally now with my new project Commonhood, it's not only how do you become creative with a collective multiplayer kind of base, but also how do you take that potentially out of the simulation and start having correlation with the real world, which is hopefully where I would like to go in the next.
Right. Yeah, the next. So I think that so as the evolution of the previous game, so now you are developing the next game, which is now not necessarily grid-based, and something really kind of you took the step further and in many aspects. So can you talk about that next game?
Absolutely. So the next game, it's called Commonhood, and if I maybe share my screen again, I have another video that could help us explain a little bit. So Commonhood is, in many ways, it's an spiritual succession from Blockhood. It's also a game about resource management and about materials, but this one is actually situated in a much more narrative environment. You're playing as a character that is starting and occupies an abandoned factory, right? So you're starting from a position of almost homelessness. You're at the edge of homelessness, but you join a community of squatters, right, that have to kind of use their own skill and their own kind of labor to kind of construct and self-provide, in a way, architecture, right? So you start by creating a workshop, start creating some machines that would allow you to build shelter, to build architecture, to build, and basically you're building a community. And in many ways, what the main data structure, the main kind of simulation here is how do you create architecture? We've created a data structure here that is not grid-based. It can follow a grid, but it's actually not necessarily a grid. And it's basically positioning the actions of a player in space, right? So if a player comes and says, I want a beam of wood in this particular location, we're storing that action of a player in space. And that's what we ultimately bundle into a group and a blueprint, right? So a blueprint, what you can see, a creation, it's not geometry, it's not a mesh, it's not points or vertices, they're just actions of a player in space. That's really helpful for us because we can actually do a timeline and go back to the very first action, which is maybe placing a stick or a panel or a piece of concrete, right, in the floor, and then seeing the sequence, how that particular creation became a piece of architecture. So the game is all about creating these blueprints, sharing them with other players, and creating kind of a thriving community within this factory, right? So the game has, in a way, a social commentary on some of the inequality and the politics that are happening today, and inviting players to kind of consider ecological systems for developing communities, right? And obviously there's a narrative associated with this whole process, and how do you kind of create a thriving community
Right.
from within this simulated space.
Right. But when you talk about community, you talk about like you online users community who shares all the resource or knowledge or game playing, but also you are talking about the community with the virtual agent who has each kind of how the behavior. I mean, no player characters, but they have their kind of activities, and you work with them or live with them, and you wanna develop a virtual community as well. That's quite interesting to me. And but do you think that is a kind of a simulation of actual real life community building, like a simulation, or it's something for you to like stimulate your creativity or problem solving or seeking potential problem or that kind of a simulation?
Right. So I don't think of this community, this simulated community, as a real community. I think that the simulation, it's a simulation of labor. So what you're actually, the insight that you get as a designer is how much the scarcity of resources, the scarcity of labor, the scarcity of knowledge, right? The game really kind of frames the difficulties of accessing some of these, resources in many ways, right? So when you simulate a character, you're not only simulating its capacity to work. In our case, we're simulating more things, right? Like their desires, their kind of expectations, their sense of hope, in a way, for a community to thrive. So that's why I call a community, in a way. So the game doesn't try to be just a labor simulation, although the simulation of labor does happen, but it's actually framed by a much larger kind of notion of what where should the wealth of production, where should if you thrive and you create kind of a beautiful initiative, who owns that, right? Is it just the player, or is it kind of shared by the members that were working with you? Do you have kind of an employer kind of relationship, or do you have more of a peer or a relationship with these other kind of simulated entities, right? So I think there's a lot of reflection upon how do we situate ourselves as architects when we design either as leaders or as part of a larger group, and ultimately what is the value of what we produce, who benefits from that value being produced.
Right. So in a way, like you, so you through that you're doing the two things. One thing is you not only by the constraint of resource, you kind of create program inside that game space. Then you as designer, or not you necessarily, but the player, anybody, solve the problem by designing. That program, or then also there's a community, virtual community, which also creates opportunity and also problem. So you also need to design something for community, or you need to think about that. So you develop your skill or like awareness and solution to those problems. But when you propose a problem inside the game, that would have value in real life, right? In real life, that might work in kind of real community, possibly. So that, I think that's the thing, like, I mean, to me, quite amazing. But so that like a sense, you are really touching the issue of a kind of social community in the way nobody else is doing, through games. It's quite interesting. At the same time, like when I saw the Common Food new game, that like a previous game was kind of there's a sense of like a utopian atmosphere, and then the newer game, the second game, you have kind of dystopian atmosphere. So I thought it's kind of the kind of switch, but when I asked this last time, and you mentioned that's not because of that kind of choice of atmosphere, it's because you moved to Detroit, and they have real issues. So you reflect your kind of new situation, and then like walking the street and talking to people there, you came up with this scenario where like you wanted to work on that. So that's why you build this game in a way.
Well, I think that Detroit, moving to Detroit has been part of it, but I've been working on this game for several years now. I'm originally from Chile, and Chile is going through a big kind of social transformation. So I think that in many ways, some of the social challenges that I see in Chile have also been central to like the thinking of a kind of simulation that is that has more of the social, that has more of the political as part of it, that also tries to question if architecture is capable, or what is the role of architecture in some of these big problems, right? I'm not suggesting that architecture can solve any of this, but perhaps the way we practice architecture, the relationships that we produce when practicing architecture could be reframed, or we should question them, right? So I think that in many ways, my Chilean and South American heritage have been central to the formulation of the problem. And obviously, since I migrated, I became an immigrant in the US, the local context, issues of homelessness in different cities in the United States, and also the cities like Detroit were always inspirational to kind of create a setting that would talk about some of these conditions. But in a way, trying to do so in a way in which it didn't feel like you're necessarily fixing the problem, but rather kind of entangled and kind of existing within a kind of an environment condition that it's what we see every day, right? Yeah.
Good. And so I mean, like in computation area or computation design to or the digital architecture area, like it's still kind of rare to tackle like a social issues kind of directly, and then especially in Japan, like we have like a disaster recovery situation, and then there should be the things we can do, but yeah, still like attacking with the computation is kind of a like frontier territory. So yeah, your work is very inspiring in that sense. At the same time, so then you are, so this Common Food game also kind of attack the issue of like a value and the distribution of value, right? So value creation, as a player kind of come up with some design and you can share with that. And you talk about like sometimes criticize like architecture competition, like traditional architecture competition as a kind of monopoly, like one guy wins all, that kind of situation. So you are showing kind of antithesis to that, and then that, so then kind of creating alternative, not really economic system, but like a certain type of democracy with full of fairness in creativity. So that's kind of one of the things you want to really kind of tell people through your game, in a way.
Right. So I guess that you're referring. I wrote this book, right, called The Architecture for the Commons, and the subtitle of the book is Participatory Systems in the Age of Platforms, right? Considering that we're living in a time where we have things like Facebook and YouTube and Instagram and social platforms in general, what would be the way in which such platforms could have an impact for architecture? And obviously, the impact could be very negative or very positive. And this is my approach, obviously, and my opinion, which I kind of pour into the book. The negative version that I detect, and obviously working with several authors that have kind of framed critique to platforms, has to do with the centralization of power. It has to do with the centralization of information systems, but also the capacity of these systems to, when we start thinking of those into the fabrication industry, they could potentially vertically integrate. They could potentially alienate or kind of own or create a kind of a monopoly on production, right? I think that one of the recent companies that was attempting to do this was Catera, but recently was announced that it kind of, filed for bankruptcy due to not really being able to solve this equation, this kind of very complex equation of the construction and architecture and construction industry. That is, how do you vertically integrate? How do you kind of own the whole production chain from top to bottom on something like a housing project, right? And that is an incredibly challenging problem. But I think that there would be a huge issue or social issue of actually having a company that manages to do that, right? Because it would actually potentially could create a big monopoly. It potentially could remove the possibility for many players, many kind of actors in the economy to contribute to the diversity of thought, the diversity of ideas, the diversity of the field of architecture as we know it today, right? You would start centralizing who gets to do architecture, right? And often in the past, these groups have incredible power for lobbying and defining the future of the industry. So I'm in the book, I do a kind of a strong case for distributed systems, for systems that celebrate the fact that we can have parts that could be produced by different people, right? And those parts could be coordinated to work together and create architecture. So in many ways, yes, the games are one attempt to consider what would be producing infrastructure, right? Supporting such a vision where there would be multiple people around the world contributing to a catalog of parts that in a way could contribute to a very diverse form of architecture, one that is kind of created by a multiplicity of actors as opposed to one centralized notion of architecture. So I do see a connection between the ideas of the book and obviously the work that I do with projects. Obviously, I'm not saying that my projects are fundamentally solving the problem that I'm presenting in the book. I think that in the book, I make a case that my projects are attempts to address some of these issues, but obviously there's a kind of a larger picture. And I think the book really tries to present that larger picture.
Sure. Then you mentioned a discrete kind of approach, and then so kind of discrete architecture is a kind of one of architecture movement in a way, but you have your take on that, and you're working parallel to it, and then but also some of the idea is a kind of foundation of your game as well. But from your kind of previous notion, I think like the importance of discrete module or part is like interoperability in a way, like interoperable to other parts, and then people can build or people can, in a way, communicate, right? People can connect things or talk to each other or communicate, and then so that connection not only become kind of building block, but also the community building block or some way. So is that kind of a right?
Yeah. So I think that I started working on discrete systems, and the project in a way has become a collective project of the discrete with the Bloom project in 2012. The Bloom project was kind of something like a giant Lego piece that was using parts that could be combined in many different ways. And remember that at this time, we were still, I would say, in computation, and I would say in many ways, computation is still following a paradigm of non-standard, right? So you can create any form, but then you would use either Grasshopper or scripting to kind of break that complex form into different parts, and all those parts would contribute to the whole. So the notion of the discrete, and I remember when I wrote it in that first paper, was how do we reconsider serial repetition, which is an old idea that we had kind of left behind. Serial repetition, the idea of doing parts the same, was kind of, in a way, boring and already done. We were moving towards bespoke architecture. But how if we reconsider serial repetition, but instead of, in order to create difference, in order to create differentiation of form, we allow the patterning or combination of those parts to be the mechanism that would allow for differentiation. So the Bloom project was a first experiment on considering something like discrete architecture that would say, look, the forms would be different, not because the parts are different, but because we're combining parts that are the same, different. And that for me also had a very playful approach, right? So the moment of combining the parts together could be playful. So the game was presented as a physical game, right? But in a way, since 2012, it became clear to me that discrete architecture was an approach to tectonics, of how do parts of architecture can really allow for a collective organization where people, architects, can come up with designs as patterns and arrangements of simple parts, right? And that potentially can yield complexity, can yield sophistication, can yield, bespoke forms of architecture, but it doesn't have to do so at the cost of a non-standard form of production, right? Which in no way we have seen that there's kind of an economy of scale to such production. The contrary, I would say it's the case, which we've seen non-standard design becoming a kind of design very associated with a very kind of inaccessible client, let's put it that way, a kind of a small portion of the architectural community that doesn't seem to serve kind of a large community of architecture, right? So I'm thinking of a model that could potentially be far more plausible for a community at large.
Right. Okay, this is a really fascinating talk. Especially, I like to talk more about this combinatory issue and the richness of that, especially like referencing like the work domain. But sadly, we don't have much time left. So now I need to wrap up, and then, well, actually, you don't have time. So yeah, okay. First, I just want to just let people know that your next game is gonna be out in November this year.
Correct. So by the end of this year, roughly we're thinking at the end of November or so, but we are working on releasing that game, which right now Commonhood is on a free public demo. So if anybody's interested on trying it, they can go into our website and you will go into our, you can request a key and you'll get a key. Next week, we are part of the Steam Festival as well. The next festival is where we're going to be releasing a much more larger version of this demo. So if you're interested in the work and seeing what we have so far, by all means, join our community and reach out. We have a Discord channel where we kind of, have a lot of conversation with the people playing the game about what are the next steps, how to improve the project. And then, the final release is going to come later this year. So I invite you to, and that's going to be Steam. Steam is our kind of platform of choice to release this content.
Right. That's quite exciting. So, okay, then now can you tell us the next steps? Who are you gonna invite?
Right, exactly. So I'm very excited about this series and how they're kind of passing from person to person. I'm gonna have the chance to interview our next speaker, who's Casey Ream. Casey Ream is an architect and a programmer based in Los Angeles in SciArc. He's been teaching in SciArc for quite some time. I had the chance to meet Casey together with Sujihara-san in Los Angeles, and it's been a really interesting kind of series of conversations and development of, I think, ideas in regards to computation. So I couldn't think of someone better to kind of to kind of, especially when in his work on machine learning, which I'm very interested. I think he has kind of a fantastic body of research that would be very interesting to see here.
Great. That seems exciting. So I think that's in 2 weeks of the day. So I think, yeah, now we kind of end our conversation. And yeah, thank you very much for your talk today. That was quite fun. I hope we're going to talk to you soon as well. So, all right.
Thank you so much.
All right. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.